wondered why some of the most devastating events in history were not caused by inherently evil individuals, but rather by ordinary people who simply followed orders, stayed silent, or refused to think critically. Have you noticed that often it's not malice but blind compliance, not hatred but apathy, not cruelty but thoughtlessness that enables the worst kinds of harm to flourish? It's a troubling idea, one that demands uncomfortable reflection, because it means that danger doesn't always arrive with horns and menace. Sometimes it comes smiling, sometimes it looks like your neighbor, sometimes it looks like you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian who resisted the Nazi regime and ultimately paid with his life, saw this truth more clearly than most. From within the walls of a prison cell, as totalitarianism consumed his country, Bonhoeffer came to a haunting conclusion. Human stupidity, more than deliberate evil, was the true threat to humanity. It wasn't Hitler alone that destroyed lives and poisoned society. It was the silent majority who turned away, the workers who said they were just doing their jobs, the citizens who didn't question the news, the friends who remained quiet at dinner tables. Evil may have lit the match, but stupidity carried the flame. This isn't an insult to intelligence. Bonhoeffer was not speaking of low IQ or academic performance. He was speaking of a spiritual and moral blindness, a kind of thoughtless surrender where people stop examining truth for themselves and begin parroting whatever narrative is most comfortable, most dominant, or most popular. In Bonhoeffer's words, stupidity is not an intellectual defect, but a moral one. It is not about being unable to think, but about choosing not to, about letting someone else do your thinking for you, about outsourcing conscience to the collective. And that's what makes stupidity so much more dangerous than evil. Evil, when exposed, tends to arouse opposition. It can be confronted, resisted, punished. Evil knows it is wrong. It schemes, it manipulates, it hides. But stupidity has no such awareness. It does not hide because it doesn't know it's doing harm. It feels virtuous, even righteous. The stupid person is often sincere, even kind in their intentions. They might believe they are helping. They might call their silence tolerance, and their inaction peace. But Bonhoeffer knew better. A person who cannot be reasoned with, who refuses self-examination, who accepts authority without critique, is not just misguided. They are dangerous. Because stupidity, unlike evil, is contagious. It spreads not by argument, but by osmosis. It doesn't need to be justified. It only needs to be normalized. Once a society decides that thinking is optional, that feeling good is more important than being right, that questions are trouble and obedience is virtue, stupidity becomes a cultural epidemic. And unlike evil, which is always a minority, stupidity can become the majority. It becomes law, it becomes tradition. It becomes normal, and then it becomes invisible. And once stupidity becomes invisible, it becomes immune to correction. You can confront a liar with the truth. You can expose a criminal with evidence, but you cannot wake someone who is committed to not thinking. You cannot penetrate the mind of someone who has willingly handed over their ability to reason. When stupidity reaches a critical mass in a society, it disables the very mechanisms we rely on to protect ourselves: dialogue, debate, discernment. The court of public opinion is silenced. The marketplace of ideas collapses. Critical thought, which should be the immune system of a democracy, becomes infected and paralyzed. The result is not just ignorance. It's a form of collective suicide. Bonhoeffer's insight was born from tragedy, from watching a civilized nation descend into barbarism, not because everyone was evil, but because most were complacent. Germany was not taken by a tyrant overnight. It was taken inch by inch, through subtle concessions, small acts of silence, convenient alliances. People allowed themselves to be seduced by power, comfort, fear, or nationalism, often all at once. And in doing so, they became stupid in the sense Bonhoeffer meant it. They stopped thinking for themselves. They stopped asking whether something was right, and instead asked whether it was permitted, whether it was popular, whether it was safe. This is why Bonhoeffer warned that stupidity is not an enemy we fight with logic alone, because stupidity, in its true form, is not rational. It is ideological. It is spiritual. It is the refusal to wake up, the refusal to grow up. It is easier, always, to let someone else be the adult, to let someone else bear the responsibility, to go along with the crowd, even when the crowd is headed off a cliff. Stupidity thrives in comfort zones. It feeds on fear. It makes a home in hearts that would rather be protected than provoked, entertained rather than enlightened. But Bonhoeffer didn't despair. He believed that stupidity could be overcome, but not by argument, only through liberation, only through the process of becoming inwardly free. Free from the need to conform, free from the compulsion to be liked, free from the lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing reality. He believed that the battle against stupidity was the battle for the soul of the individual, not for their intellect, but for their courage. Because to think for yourself in times of mass confusion is an act of rebellion. It is the rarest kind of bravery. And this message is more relevant today than ever. In a world saturated with information, echo chambers, curated content, and algorithmic manipulation, the temptation to stop thinking for yourself has never been greater. It's easy to scroll, to agree, to repost, to react, but hard to slow down, hard to ask questions, hard to sit with discomfort. We are taught to value convenience over contemplation, affirmation over truth, popularity over principle. And in that soil, stupidity grows like a weed. Stupidity doesn't shout, it whispers. It says, don't worry about it. Let someone else handle that. Don't rock the boat. Stay in your lane. And bit by bit, we lose our sense of moral responsibility. We outsource our ethics. We silence our conscience. We conform, not because we are evil, but because we are tired, because it feels easier, because we are afraid of being alone in our convictions. But Bonhoeffer would tell us, the cost of this ease is far too high. The price of collective stupidity is written in the blood of history. The terrifying truth is that stupidity doesn't need a villain to thrive. It only needs silence. It only needs good people to step aside. It only needs a crowd of individuals, each convincing themselves that their voice doesn't matter, that their questions are too small, that their resistance is futile. And so the machinery of destruction continues, not fueled by rage, but by resignation. The most dangerous systems are not run by monsters, but by functionaries, by ordinary people who decided it was easier to obey than to object, to conform rather than confront. These are the people who look back decades later and say, we didn't know. But often they did. They just didn't want to know deeply enough to do something about it. Bonhoeffer's legacy is not one of condemnation, but of confrontation. He asks us not to blame, but to examine, not to despair, but to awaken. The threat of stupidity isn't just out there in institutions, governments, or other people. It lives within each of us when we abandon the responsibility to think, to feel, to act from principle. It lurks in the moments we compromise truth for comfort, in the times we let something slide because we fear speaking up, in the times we go along with a lie because it's easier than standing alone with the truth. This is why the remedy to stupidity is not simply education, it's character. Not more information, but more reflection, more humility, more courage to be wrong, and more strength to admit it. To reclaim our minds, we must first reclaim our hearts. We must relearn how to stand in discomfort, how to hold tension, how to ask questions even when they cost us. That is the slow work of freedom. That is the daily resistance against stupidity. Because the moment we stop questioning, we become vulnerable to manipulation. And the moment we stop listening, we become deaf to truth. Stupidity deadens the moral senses. It makes us blind to suffering, numb to injustice, and complicit in destruction. We don't have to hate to do harm. We only have to stop caring. We only have to stop thinking. So what can we do? Bonhoeffer believed that liberation from stupidity is not a mass movement, but a personal revolution. It begins in the solitude of conscience. It begins when we look in the mirror and ask, where have I gone silent? What truths have I ignored? Whose suffering have I chosen not to see? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the only path to integrity. To live with integrity in a world that rewards compliance is an act of resistance. To speak the truth when it is unpopular is an act of faith. To remain awake while others sleepwalk into destruction is not easy, but it is necessary. Bonhoeffer chose this path. He resisted not just the evil of the regime, but the stupidity of those who made that regime possible. He chose awareness over apathy, truth over safety, principle over popularity. And for that, he lost his life, but preserved his soul. That is the choice each of us must make. Not once, but every day. In small ways, in our conversations, in our decisions, in our willingness to think when others don't, to care when others won't, to stand when others hide. This is how the tide turns, not with grand gestures, but with quiet revolutions in everyday people. And it is in those quiet revolutions where the deepest form of courage is born. Not the kind sung in national anthems or carved into monuments, but the courage to be honest when it's inconvenient. The courage to be thoughtful in a world addicted to noise. The courage to ask why when everyone else is nodding yes. This is the kind of courage Bonhoeffer was calling us to. Not to fight fire with fire, but to fight unconsciousness with awareness. To reclaim our dignity by refusing to abandon our discernment. Stupidity, in the form Bonhoeffer describes, isn't a lack of knowledge, it's a rejection of moral responsibility. It's the willful decision to let go of your own agency, to hand over your inner compass and follow the crowd, even if the crowd walks straight into darkness. And because stupidity doesn't see itself as dangerous, it often sees those who challenge it as the real problem. If you ask questions, you're a troublemaker. If you speak truth, you're divisive. If you resist, you're inconvenient. That's the paradox. Stupidity often wears the face of politeness, but it is truth that ends up being treated like the intruder. This is why Bonhoeffer's insight remains so powerful and so unsettling. He didn't point the finger at tyrants alone. He pointed it at the quiet man in the office who rubber stamps injustice, at the teacher who stays silent in the face of propaganda, at the friend who shrugs off cruelty with a laugh and a drink. Evil is usually obvious, but stupidity, true, systemic, moral stupidity, hides behind the ordinary. It's camouflaged in the daily routines of people who don't believe they're doing anything wrong. And because of that, it is harder to confront, harder to uproot, harder to recognize until it's too late. So what does it mean to resist this form of stupidity? It means staying radically awake. It means cultivating an inner life strong enough to withstand external pressure. It means developing the moral muscle to say no, not just to evil intentions, but to passive compliance. It means being willing to be the odd one out, to be the person who refuses to laugh at the joke, who doesn't click like just because everyone else did, who chooses to stand for truth even if it means standing alone. This is not glamorous work. It won't win you applause. In fact, it may cost you comfort, friends, opportunities. But what it preserves is far greater. Your integrity, your clarity, your freedom. Bonhoeffer knew that the moment you stop thinking for yourself is the moment you become a tool, a pawn, a shadow of the person you were meant to be. And that is the death before the death, the surrender of your moral independence long before your body gives out. To reclaim that independence is to reclaim your humanity. To refuse stupidity is to say with your thoughts, your actions, and your very presence, I will not be asleep, I will not be silent, I will not be used. Because to be awake in a sleeping world is to carry a burden. It means seeing what others choose not to see. It means noticing patterns of harm that have become so normalized, they're almost invisible. It means walking through a society intoxicated with convenience and comfort and choosing, day after day, to stay sober. It is not easy to remain present when distraction is the default. It is not easy to remain principled when compromise feels like the only way to get by. But Bonhoeffer's life reminds us that doing what is right rarely aligns with what is easy. And perhaps it never has. There is a cost to awareness. You will notice what others deny. You will feel what others numb. You will speak when others defer. And for that, you may be labeled as too intense, too sensitive, too critical. But being awake is not about being harsh, it's about being human. It's about honoring the sacred responsibility that comes with a mind capable of thought and a heart capable of compassion. It's about refusing to trade your conscience for convenience. The battle against stupidity, then, is not waged in grand theaters of power. It is waged in everyday moments, in the decision to listen rather than react, to question rather than follow, to pause rather than parrot. It happens in classrooms, kitchens, boardrooms, comment sections. It happens every time you refuse to participate in cruelty, every time you choose to understand rather than assume, every time you risk discomfort for the sake of truth. These are the moments where character is forged. Bonhoeffer knew that character is not what we say we believe. It is what we are willing to stand for when no one is watching. It is not measured by the applause we receive, but by the silences we are willing to break. He saw with chilling clarity how a society could crumble not just through hatred, but through a kind of hollow conformity. When people stop thinking critically and start performing goodness, when they trade personal reflection for public image, when they fear being wrong more than they fear being complicit, then stupidity triumphs. This is why his warning continues to echo. It is not an abstract theory, but a mirror. It invites us to ask, where am I asleep? Where have I allowed convenience to replace conscience? Where have I outsourced my own discernment in exchange for acceptance or ease? These are not comfortable questions, but they are essential ones. Because the world does not change from the top down, it changes when individuals reclaim their agency. When they choose to think, to speak, to feel, to act from a place of wholeness. To do this is to interrupt the inertia of stupidity, to step out of the fog and back into your own skin. To become someone who is not easily manipulated, not easily misled, not easily silenced. That is not just a gift to yourself, it is a gift to the world. Because the world doesn't need more noise, more opinions, more certainty. It needs more humility, more courage, more people willing to stay awake, even when it hurts. It needs people who are willing to ask hard questions and sit with inconvenient truths. People who understand that real wisdom comes not from having all the answers, but from being brave enough to live with the questions. People who don't mistake groupthink for belonging or silence for peace. The antidote to stupidity is not arrogance, but awareness. And awareness demands that we return over and over again to the uncomfortable but necessary discipline of honest reflection. You begin by noticing. You begin by observing where you've gone on autopilot, where you've stopped asking, stopped feeling, stopped choosing. You begin by taking inventory of the stories you've inherited, the assumptions you've accepted, the roles you've performed to fit in. You begin, quite simply, by remembering that you have the power to choose differently, that you are not a passive product of your culture or your timeline or your family or your job. You are a moral agent. You are a thinking, breathing, feeling being, and that matters, because when enough individuals choose that path, when enough people begin to live from conscience instead of convenience, from courage instead of comfort, something changes. The culture shifts. The atmosphere clears. The group becomes smarter because the individuals within it have stopped being stupid. They are no longer outsourcing their values. They are no longer asleep at the wheel of their own lives. And in this way, a society saves itself, not by waiting for a hero, but by becoming a mosaic of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their dignity. This is the slow revolution Bonhoeffer believed in. It doesn't happen with slogans or sweeping reforms. It happens when you choose to speak the truth at your dinner table, when you ask hard questions at work, when you don't laugh at the cruel joke, when you choose your values over your image, when you refuse to pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. This is how empires of stupidity fall. Not with war, but with awakening. Bonhoeffer's own life was an embodiment of this quiet courage. He could have escaped. He had the opportunity to remain safe abroad. But he chose to return to Germany, to face the rising darkness, not with hatred, but with clarity. Not with violence, but with conviction. He believed that a faith that costs nothing is worth nothing. And more than that, he believed that resisting stupidity was a sacred task, not because it would guarantee success, but because it was right. In the end, he was executed for his resistance. But his voice echoes still, not as a martyr's cry, but as a call to attention. He reminds us that the greatest threat to justice is not only those who oppose it, but those who refuse to engage with it. The greatest threat to truth is not lies, but indifference. And the greatest threat to human dignity is not cruelty, but the kind of complacent blindness that allows cruelty to grow unchecked. To honor that message is not just to remember Bonhoeffer's words, it is to live them. It is to choose day after day to resist the drift into unconsciousness, to keep your eyes open when others close theirs, to keep your heart soft when others go numb, and to keep your voice steady when the world tells you to be quiet. Because that is the real work of being human, not just existing, but remaining conscious in the face of pressure to conform. It is the decision to embody presence rather than perform acceptance. It's choosing to carry the weight of awareness, knowing that with every moment of clarity, there may come isolation, discomfort, and even rejection. But also knowing that in choosing to stay awake, you reclaim something essential: your moral autonomy. Bonhoeffer wasn't warning us about stupidity as a personal flaw. He was sounding the alarm against a social sickness, a condition that, if left untreated, spreads through institutions, education, media, relationships, until entire cultures forget how to think, how to feel, how to discern. It's not an accident that authoritarian regimes always seek to control information, stifle questions, and reward blind loyalty. Because stupidity, in the Bonhoeffer sense, is not just a weakness, it's a strategy, a tool of manipulation, a way to build a society that polices itself not through fear alone, but through trained indifference. And the most terrifying part? Most of the people who enable this kind of society are convinced they're doing good. They wear the language of tolerance and progress and order, all while unknowingly contributing to systems that crush human dignity. That is what makes this form of stupidity so dangerous. It doesn't know it's harmful. It doesn't feel like complicity. It feels like safety, like normalcy, like just doing your job. So what happens when we realize this? When we see how much of our lives, our silence, our beliefs, even our politeness, may have been shaped not by courage, but by fear. That is the moment of crisis, but also the moment of potential. Because the moment you wake up, you are no longer part of the machinery. You may not know what to do next, but you've already interrupted the system by thinking for yourself. And that is no small thing. The first act of liberation is the refusal to participate in your own oppression. The refusal to be reduced to a function, a follower, a consumer of narratives you didn't choose. You reclaim your capacity to say no. You begin to live in alignment with what you actually believe, not what you were told to believe, not what you're rewarded for believing, but what is true for you. And when that happens, your presence becomes a kind of resistance. Not loud, not violent, but unmistakably powerful. Because a person who is awake cannot be manipulated. A person who is grounded in truth cannot be swayed by every passing wind. And a person who knows their own mind is one of the most dangerous things in a world built on unconscious obedience. Bonhoeffer saw this clearly. He saw that the future of any society rests not in the hands of the powerful, but in the choices of the ordinary. And he believed those choices began in the quiet places, in a person's conscience, in their courage, in the questions they ask when no one is watching. That is where the real battle is won or lost, not in revolutions, but in reflections. Because in the stillness of those reflections, we find the roots of our deepest values, not the ones we recite, but the ones we live. In those quiet moments when no one is there to approve or disapprove, we meet the raw truth of who we are. And if we listen carefully, if we are brave enough to stay in that space, we might begin to hear the quiet voice we've long ignored. The voice that tells us when something is wrong, when something is off, when something cannot be allowed to continue. That voice, Bonhoeffer believed, is sacred. And the more we drown it in noise, the more we trade it for applause or efficiency or convenience, the closer we come to losing our humanity altogether. This is the slow erosion that stupidity causes. Not sudden, not dramatic, but incremental. It numbs the soul. It dulls the conscience. It creates a culture where everything is tolerated except depth, where people are praised for agreeing and punished for feeling, where moral clarity is replaced with moral neutrality, and truth becomes whatever the majority is most comfortable with. And in such a culture, stupidity doesn't look like chaos, it looks like peace. But it is a counterfeit peace, built on suppression and fear. That's why Bonhoeffer called on individuals, not systems, not governments, but human beings, to resist from within. Because only individuals can truly think. Only individuals can choose truth over tribalism. Only individuals can step out of the collective trance and say, I will not play this part anymore. And once enough people make that choice, the collective begins to shift. Not because the crowd suddenly awakens, but because enough individuals choose not to be the crowd. This is the foundation of a moral society. Not laws or leaders, but people with the courage to feel, to question, to break the rules when the rules are wrong, to disrupt the norm when the norm is dehumanizing. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is rebellion in service of conscience. And conscience, Bonhoeffer believed, is the last defense against stupidity. Because conscience cannot be programmed, it cannot be outsourced. It is something you carry or you lose. And so the question becomes, what kind of person are you willing to be? Not when the cameras are on, not when there's a medal to win or a vote to cast, but when no one sees, when the only one who will know is you. That is the true measure of moral maturity. That is where wisdom lives. And that is what makes the difference between being a participant in stupidity and being a light in the darkness. It's not about being perfect. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about refusing to abandon the responsibility of thinking for yourself, feeling for yourself, deciding for yourself. It's about recognizing that every time you choose silence in the face of harm, you reinforce the very structures you claim to oppose. And every time you choose to question, to name, to feel, however small that act may seem, you weaken those structures. You don't need to change the world all at once. You only need to stop betraying your own clarity. Because clarity, once claimed, has a way of reshaping everything. It changes how you speak, how you listen, how you choose your work, your relationships, your values. Clarity cuts through the fog of conformity. It silences the static of groupthink. It brings you back to something unshakable, your own internal compass, not perfect, not infallible, but yours. And that is what makes you dangerous to any system that relies on unthinking participation. A person in possession of their own clarity is not easily swayed, not easily seduced, and certainly not easily silenced. Bonhoeffer wasn't asking people to be heroes. He was asking them to be honest. He wasn't looking for saints. He was pleading for citizens. People who were willing to stand up, not in grand gestures, but in small refusals. To refuse to laugh at cruelty. To refuse to accept the lie. To refuse to trade moral agency for the illusion of safety. Because the real safety lies not in submission, but in integrity. And integrity is never a collective act. It is deeply personal. It happens in moments of choice, again and again, when you are tempted to go along, and instead choose to be real. It is that choice that interrupts the machinery of stupidity. It is that act of inner freedom that defies the gravitational pull of group obedience. Not by shouting, not by accusing, but by simply existing in truth. The people who live this way, quiet, grounded, unwavering, become a kind of immune system within society. They are not flashy, they do not need attention. But their presence is a kind of resistance, a kind of medicine, a reminder to the rest of us that there is another way to be. Because the battle between stupidity and conscience is not one on stages or in headlines. It is one in kitchens, in classrooms, in board meetings, in late-night thoughts before sleep. It is one when someone chooses to leave the room rather than participate in harm. It is one when someone says, "That's not okay," even if it costs them approval. It is one when someone turns inward and asks, "Is this who I want to be?" That is how culture changes. That is how we reclaim dignity, not just for ourselves, but for one another. Stupidity, as Bonhoeffer warned us, is never just a personal flaw. It's a social disease. But like any disease, it only spreads when conditions are right. And those conditions are created when we prioritize ease over effort, popularity over principle, and comfort over clarity. We all carry the potential for stupidity. But we also carry the antidote: awareness, responsibility, reflection. The willingness to walk through the world not just reacting, but choosing. To be fully human in a society that rewards automation is an act of rebellion. To be awake in a world addicted to performance is a radical choice. But it is the only choice that leads to freedom. Not just the freedom to speak, but the freedom to live in alignment with your own soul. Bonhoeffer believed this freedom was worth everything, even his life. And his death was not in vain, because his words still ask something of us today. They ask us to remember, to question, to listen, to feel, and most of all, to never hand over the sacred task of thinking for ourselves. Because the moment we hand over our ability to think, we cease to be fully alive. We become vessels for someone else's agenda, instruments of a machinery that does not require our compassion, our discernment, or our values, only our compliance. That is the real cost of stupidity. Not just harm to others, but the quiet erosion of our own humanity. Bonhoeffer saw this not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived reality. He saw educated, capable, even kind people surrender their moral judgment, not out of malice, but out of fear, habit, or the desperate desire to belong. It's easy to believe that those days are behind us, that what happened in Bonhoeffer's time is a relic of history. But that belief is itself a symptom of the same disease he warned about. Stupidity thrives when people assume they are immune to it, when they believe they would never go along with injustice, when they believe that knowledge alone is enough to protect them. But Bonhoeffer knew better. Intelligence is not the same as wisdom. Education is not the same as moral clarity. And progress is not the same as awareness. We must never forget how quickly societies can drift into darkness, not because people are evil, but because they grow numb, because they stop noticing, because they mistake silence for peace. Bonhoeffer's message is a reminder that vigilance is not paranoia. It is a form of love. Love for truth, love for justice, love for the fragile, beautiful experiment that is human dignity. And that love requires work. It requires discomfort. It requires sacrifice. But it also offers something profound, the chance to live a life that is real, not curated, not performative, not shaped by external approval. A life that is aligned, sincere, and grounded in something deeper than popularity. When we begin to live this way, we shift the culture around us, even if only slightly. We become one small thread of integrity in a larger tapestry, and those threads matter. They hold things together when everything else falls apart. Bonhoeffer knew he might not live to see the change he believed in, but he lived and died with the conviction that his small thread mattered, that his voice, even if silenced, would echo, that his integrity, even if it cost him everything, was worth preserving. And he was right. His words continue to awaken those who are willing to hear them, not just to warn, but to empower, not to shame, but to ignite something courageous and clear. You do not need to be loud to be powerful. You do not need to be perfect to be worthy. You only need to be willing, to stay present, to stay honest, to stay awake. In a world desperate for distraction, your attention is a form of resistance. In a culture drowning in performance, your authenticity is revolutionary. And in a time when so many would rather go along to get along, your refusal to betray your own clarity is more powerful than you know. That is the real inheritance Bonhoeffer left us. Not just a warning about stupidity, but a pathway back to ourselves. It's a path that invites us not to despair over the darkness of the world, but to ask, what part of the light is mine to carry? What conversation is mine to have? What silence is mine to break? These are not grand rhetorical questions. They are invitations to a different way of living, one that doesn't rely on external validation, one that doesn't wait for permission, one that doesn't collapse under the weight of discomfort. This is a life built on conscience, not consensus. Because consensus, while comforting, can be deceptive. It tells you that if enough people agree, then it must be right. But history has shown us time and again that collective agreement can justify the unjust, normalize the inhumane, and silence the true. Bonhoeffer understood that mass acceptance is not the same as moral clarity. That truth is not determined by how many people believe it, but by whether it aligns with the dignity of the human spirit. And to live by that truth, especially when it is unpopular, is to live with integrity. This kind of life may not look impressive from the outside. It may not earn applause or attention. In fact, it might look quiet, unassuming, even lonely. But it is deeply rooted. It does not sway in every wind. It does not need to be seen to be solid, because its foundation is not external, it is inward. And that inward strength is the most resilient force in the face of stupidity. Not because it is louder, but because it is truer. So if you find yourself questioning, doubting, feeling out of place in a world that moves too fast, speaks too loud, and rarely asks why, take heart. That discomfort may be the very proof that you are still awake, that you are still listening to something deeper than noise, that you have not traded your capacity for thought in exchange for the illusion of peace. This world doesn't need more opinions, it needs more conscience. More people who are willing to slow down and reflect, who are willing to feel their way through the fog, who are willing to stand even when standing feels like standing alone. These people are not heroes in the cinematic sense. They are quiet revolutionaries, teachers who tell the truth, parents who raise thoughtful children, friends who challenge each other with love, neighbors who ask, is this just or just easy? And in a society where stupidity has been normalized, These are the people who create the cracks in the surface, small but vital fractures through which light gets in. They may not change the world overnight, but they are changing the air we breathe, the ground we stand on, the future we build. Because ultimately, Bonhoeffer was not just calling us to resist stupidity. He was calling us to return to our full humanity, to reclaim what makes us capable of more than obedience, our capacity for reflection, for courage, for love that is not blind, but brave. He was asking us to remember who we are before the world told us who to be. And remembering who we are is not some abstract, poetic exercise. It is a radical act in a time of forgetting. It is about digging beneath the layers of programming, propaganda, and passive conditioning that have dulled our inner voice. It's about reclaiming the ability to say, "This is what I believe. This is where I stand. This is what I will no longer accept." Because the truth is, many of us are not lost. We are simply asleep. And waking up, though painful, is the first act of liberation. You may find, as Bonhoeffer did, that waking up separates you, that you lose comfort, relationships, even safety. But what you gain is something priceless: your voice, your clarity, your sacred place in the world as someone who lives with integrity, not for performance, but for purpose. In a society where conformity is currency, authenticity is rebellion. And not the kind of rebellion that burns everything down, but the kind that quietly refuses to disappear. Because in the end, stupidity asks only one thing of you: to stop asking, to stop feeling, to stop choosing. It is not aggressive, it is seductive. It lures you into disengagement, it tempts you with ease. It tells you that your questions are too much, your conscience too inconvenient, your resistance too idealistic. But Bonhoeffer reminds us that the truly dangerous thing is not being too much. It's being too silent, too numb, too absent from your own life. So what now? We begin as we must with the smallest and most radical gesture: presence. We begin by noticing where we've gone blind. We begin by choosing honesty over harmony, truth over comfort, awareness over approval. We begin by building a new relationship with ourselves, one where we do not betray what we know to be true for the sake of fitting in. One where we carry ourselves with the quiet dignity of people who are no longer willing to disappear. You will not always be met with applause, but you will sleep deeper, you will speak truer, you will stand firmer. And when history looks back, when your children ask what kind of person you were in times of mass distraction, you will not need to search for an answer. You will already be living it. Bonhoeffer's words were forged in a time of terror, but they speak to us now, in this moment, with quiet urgency. He is not asking us to be perfect. He is asking us to be awake, to be clear, to be willing to live not just in the light, but as light. Because when enough people choose to stop being stupid, not cruel, not unkind, but unconscious, then the world itself becomes harder to deceive, harder to manipulate, harder to destroy. And maybe, just maybe, that is how we begin again.